Now, what do the new economic powers such as China and India have in common with, say, European hedge funds or US universities? They are all accused of using their influence and wealth to buy land cheaply across Africa. Take a look at this map that I've got up here. It's a map of Africa. It's from the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. It says here, worldwide up to 115 million acres of farmland are leased to foreign investors, and the bulk of that is in Africa. You can see China's a big player here, Mozambique, Zambia, Democratic Republic of Congo over there. Let me move to Ethiopia. That's where you see the Indian flag planted over there. And it's the biggest foreign direct investor in Ethiopia. And Germany also has a bit of a stake over there. Now, 70% of the land on sale there is for food production by India. But most Indian companies reportedly re-export most of those crops out of Ethiopia. It's of course one of the hungriest countries in the world, and you don't need reminding. We always see pictures of famines in Ethiopia. Activists say the actions of Indian companies are uprooting local communities and then causing fears of a bigger food crisis. Well, joining us now via Skype is Anuradha Mittal, founder and executive director of the Oakland Institute. It's an independent think tank that tracks important social, economic, and environmental issues around the world. Also with us is Christine Adamo, who runs the Africa Biofuel Company with operations in Kenya and Tanzania. Thanks a lot for joining us, ladies. Anuradha, if I could start with you, give us a sense of the big picture here, because it's a lot to get your head across. When I read your Oakland Institute report, I was quite shocked at so many new pieces of information that I felt I was almost bombarded with. I was embarrassed that I didn't know so much about it. Do you feel that, on the whole, this is not in the best interests of African countries?
Well, I think the question is not about investment being good or being bad. The question is what kind of investment. And the reports you're referring to, we have studied 7 countries in detail in Africa and looked at over 50 such land deals and looking at the key players. And the findings are just incredible. As you mentioned before, first of all, we are seeing huge tracts of land have been taken over all over the world in poor country. Most of them are actually in Africa. And we assume that this investment would lead to job creation, would lead to improved food security or economic development. But when we start breaking down the business plans and the numbers, what we are finding is that it's a net loss, not just for the communities who are losing their land, but also for the economy. So you have to question, what kind of investment do we want for these countries? Just putting money there is not going to result in, job creation or improved food security.
But Anuradha, all of this is above board. All of these are done with the correct permits, signed off by the relevant authorities. So there is a mandate for all of this to be done. It's not as if the wool is being pulled over people's eyes, is it?
Well, what our studies show, first of all, it really varies. In certain cases, because of the colonial history of Africa, where customary land, where commons are considered as state lands, so people might have been living on land for generations or have been cultivating the land for 40, 50 years, but they can be regarded as squatters and dismissed by the private investors and by the government. In other cases, the principle of free, prior, informed consent, a principle that is adopted and followed by most of the financial institutions, International Finance Corporation, European Development Bank, that is being ignored. Lastly, I would say in terms of legal, what is legal? Apartheid used to be legal. So we really have to start talking about a process by which communities, impacted communities, host countries have a real say in what kind of policies are being created that lead to the best national development. Let me be very clear, we are not against investment. We do not want investors to lose money. But if your reason to rush to Africa is that you can get fertile, incredible land for which you would pay $26,000 per hectare in UK or $18,000 in United States, if you're rushing to countries such as Tanzania, where you're paying basically 23 cents per hectare, there's a problem with that.
Christine, many companies are making a killing out of investing in Africa, particularly when it comes to arable land. Do you have a clear conscience with regards to your company and the sort of work that you're doing, creating jobs and making sure everybody gets a fair cut out of it?
Well, let me just first state that the companies that are making killings out of land are doing exactly that. Africa, unfortunately, has become a victim for foreign investors coming in and doing great land grabs under the guise and rubric of improving agricultural productivity and or job creation. I've been in Africa with Africa Biofuel since 2006. We are looking to launch in first quarter of 2012. Now, when you ask me about a free conscience, our business model does not require and does not indicate that we own any land. We are very sensitive to the fact that land and land issues and land right issues are very unsettled in all parts of Africa, and our focus has been East Africa, operating in Tanzania and Kenya. We are working with both governments in the development of partnerships to plant trees in areas of these countries that have been designated as national forests. These national forests are eroded, non-productive, and not settled. There are no people in the lands that we're seeking to partner with government to plant trees. There's no people living on these pieces of land because these lands have no water, they have no fertilization, and no utility for cultivation. They've been robbed and stripped of all the natural resources, minerals, and vegetation.
Okay.
So that's our model.
Okay, let's jump into some of the feedback here.
Anuradha, you were speaking about colonialism and how perhaps a lot of these problems arise from that. We have Basque Matt saying, African land has always been taken by countries throughout history. The players are just different. So echoing your point. And then Lola Mohammed Noor saying, commercial farms pressure farmers to make profit via cash crops rather than feed themselves. And we understand 70% of people who live on the African continent live off of the land. So the question to you comes from this tweet from Peter Burgess. He says, why is or how is corporate colonialism any better than the old European colonialism? It isn't, it is significantly worse. Do you see a distinction there?
Well, actually, if you think of the colonizers in the past, they used to be called East India Company. They were still traders. And that's how the colonizing forces had come in. So not to make it too simplistic, but in some ways it is the same model of businesses, corporations coming in. And yes, some of the players are different. You mentioned Chinese and Indians before, but as our research has shown, it includes US universities who are investing in private equity and hedge funds who are promising 20 to 40% returns. It is pension funds, Dutch pension funds to Theakref, who are investing in it. And of course, there are the new players of Indian corporations and the Japanese and the South Koreans. So there's not much of a difference. And yes, Africa has been for taking for centuries. And I would also say that very often people would say, well, we are not buying land. In a lot of countries, you cannot buy land, but the minute you lease land, and very often there are 50 to 99-year leases, it actually amounts to treating local people who have been using those lands as squatters, getting rid of them, displacing them. We have interacted with investors who have talked about these lands being, nobody is living on them, and our research showed that people were living on them. And just because they do not have the Western concept of private property, they're seen as available land. So we need to be very clear that lease for 99 years, 20, 40 years without consent of the people amounts to land grab.
Yeah, and just for the record, I think it's important to note that we had approached Agri-SA, which facilitated many South African farmers going to the Democratic Republic of Congo and getting leased land at a very lucrative rate over there, many hectares of land, as well as the big agribusiness group Emergent as well. Anand, as you look at the spectrum now of all these African nations involved, it differs from country to country. Do you see anything that disturbs you in this trend?
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you were to step back a minute from the conclusions of the report, which are very eye-opening, the larger point here is that I think India and China and others that have come upon this kind of influence very quickly, in a kind of blink of history, come upon this money very quickly to do the kinds of things that they're describing, has really not thought through what kind of power they want to exert in the world. And this is true in the oil space. So if you talk to the folks at ONGC, the Indian National Upstream Oil Company, I remember I once had an interview with him about Sudan, and I said, you guys are doing a deal with Sudan, you're the world's largest democracy, doing a deal with Sudan in the middle of Darfur genocide. Don't you think you have a responsibility? And he said, you know, we're not a rich country and we don't have the luxury of making some slogan. That's what he said. And I think that gets to the heart of what we're talking about here. It's not just the specific land grabs in Ethiopia. These are countries that now have huge amounts of power without having developed the compass that power requires. And it's very important to also think about, even in this country, there's a huge domestic constituency for how America behaves in the world, whether it's one way or another. But people care about that as an issue. I don't really think in India, India's behavior in the world is yet politicized. I don't think it's something people argue about. And that's probably something that needs to start to happen.
Okay, let's go back to Anuradha before we get Christine back. Christine, zoning in on India in, Anuradha, rather, apologies. Zoning in on India in particular and its influence in Ethiopia. There's the criticism that, you know, cash crops are being grown for the foreign markets. There's a little caricature that I have on my screen here where an Ethiopian activist has caricatured Meles Zenawi as a sort of pimp, you know, opening up his jacket saying Ethiopia land for sale, opening itself up to India. Do you characterize India's relationship with Ethiopia as a sort of big brother, small brother relationship, and ironically similar to how some other nations have treated India in the past?
Well, definitely, as Anand was pointing out earlier, instead of dealing with the crucial question, what kind of power do we want to be? What kind of country do we want to be in this world? We have this attitude of being the big brother right now and doing what I've said in few other places, that the colonized has now become the colonizer. Having said that, I also want to say that we have to look at the larger development paradigm, which is being promoted by the rich donor countries, for instance, the United States and its aid arm, USAID, or you have to look at the World Bank that is promoting this development paradigm, is actually supporting the so-called South-South cooperation. In fact, USAID has a program whereby it is assisting Indian corporations gain entry into East African countries, including Uganda, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. And in fact, now they're trying to include South Sudan in the picture.
If I can just add to that point, just to amplify that, share something that an analysis we did a few years ago that I think is fascinating, that explains this. If you look at the last 500 or 1,000 years of economic history data, basically which were the richest countries, who rose and fell, we are in the middle of an unprecedented situation right now. If you look at the 5 largest economies in the world going back 500 or 1,000 years, they have almost always been also countries that were rich in per capita terms. Right? We've never had countries that were individually poor but rich in the aggregate. And right now, in the top 5 economies in the world, we have 2 countries that are in the bottom half in poverty in the world, and yet have the influence. And what that means, to put it in simpler terms, is $1 trillion of power steered by a $1,000 a year mentality. And that's just a new reality that I think we're beginning to deal with.
Well, I mean, in that context, you spoke about Uganda, and, you know, we've seen that there have been political, you could say, scrambles, you could say, in terms of government officials being involved in what is being called the sugar crisis by Indian companies coming in, being invited, allegedly to set up businesses there. And we have tweets, Christine, I want to give this to you, that question how complicit the actual countries or the nations in Africa are in this process. I know we touched on it a little bit, but Habtoum is saying governments are looking at the immediate relief the money brings in, but not the long-term effect of letting go of fertile land. And many people are echoing this. I mean, PF Redmo puts the question very directly, how much complicity is there with African nations in letting foreign nations come in and use this land?
Well, that's an excellent question. Our experience in the past 5.5 years has verified what all of you are discussing right now. As you know, I represent a U.S. investment group that has a business model that relies upon partnership with the African government and a joint venture with a local minority partner. And I think governments are still trying to take a quantum leap away from practices that have been ingrained for decades. And I see government buckling under a lot of weight of cash. There still is a lot of corruption in these governments, and the old guard is still quite prevalent. And if you come in as a DFI with a large bushel barrel of money, then you will get your land. And you'll get your land very quickly. You'll get it with no questions asked. And you'll be permitted to begin your development. Now, what is interesting in the biofuel sector, renewable energy, if you will, and it's an agricultural model, the opportunity for Africa to lead the world in biofuel is very, very real. Only I personally believe that it's going to take 50 years to see that happen, because DFI have flooded in. They have gotten these land grants very illegally, and the minute they've gone to try to incorporate their plantings, the local communities have gone up in uprising. I've personally witnessed stoning of Brazilians, stoning of Italians in Kenya. I have personally witnessed communities pushing Brits out of southern Tanzania. And I say good for them, because these foreign investors have grabbed land illegally and have plopped a lot of money in the right places to get those land grants. But what it has done, unfortunately, for these governments, it's squashing good economic development. Because there is a place for biofuel development in Africa that doesn't compete with food security, that doesn't compete for the use of land for agricultural purposes, and it opens up a new market for lots of local rural Africans who are in need of earning power. You know, people want to make money. Everybody continues to say, you know, Africans need to continue to create their crops. People want to make money. They'd rather go to a grocery store and buy food than have to rely on their own farms.
Okay, I want to bring Anuradha in here because I want to talk about water now. We're talking about food insecurity and the issue of sort of exploitation. I was reading an article in the New Scientist saying that all of this is perhaps leading us down an ominous road which could open up the opportunity of future water wars. Do you think that that's a realistic possibility, given that so much water is needed, water that many African countries can't extract themselves and exploit themselves? This water is needed for that food production. Do you think that water wars are possibly around the corner if something doesn't change?
Excellent question. Actually, we have heard the term land grab a lot, but we're not hearing about water grabs. What we hear is that people are looking for lands or putting into use lands which are available, which are infertile, they're making them productive. But in our research, most of the investors are looking for lands which are fertile, which are close to water, which are close to infrastructure and transport, and close to markets. And along with that comes complete water rights. For instance, if you look at Atlas, Chaitin Atlas fund out of England, but registered in Cayman Islands for tax purposes or tax holidays, they basically told us that internally we called our Africa Land Fund a water fund. Or if you look at Emergent, for instance, whom you had contacted, in Mozambique, in the Matuba project, communities are living there, they're using the land and they're using the water from the canal that's there. But they have managed to secure complete water rights and put in pumps to just take all the water out without any concern for the impact on the rest of the communities.
Anuradha, I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you there because this is television for you. We always run out of time of things to say, particularly when we have fantastic, articulate guests. Anuradha, Christine, and Anand, thanks a lot for joining us. It's a big topic that we can't get across in just 25 minutes, but thanks for joining us. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.